Greetings. My name is Jalandra A. Davis, otherwise known as Mommy Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist Podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Greetings and welcome back to the Merwomanist Podcast with Mommy Melusine. For those of you who have access to the video, I'm actually doing a video episode today because I'm just so proud of myself for organizing my bookshelves and cleaning out my office. I'm actually hoping to make some content around my office redo because I just think I did a great job. But I'm still in the process of getting art up and doing a few more things. But yeah, I'm excited about that. So I decided to come on video, even though I'm not putting pressure on myself to do all of these episodes as video episodes this season. So welcome back. And today is going to be my mid-season review of House of the Dragon, or as Black folks call it, House of Dragons, because we always just make things more efficient in terms of language. I also sometimes find myself calling it Dance of the Dragons. Dance of the Dragons is the sort of oral lore name in the histories of this conflict for the conflict that is at the center of this show. So a little bit about House of the Dragons. This is a spinoff. Well, is it a spinoff? This is a prequel series to HBO's Game of Thrones. It takes place, I think it's 300 years. I'm not sure. A few centuries before the events of Game of Thrones. And it is explaining how, I'm not going to explain Game of Thrones. So if you're not a Game of Thrones watcher, I don't know what to tell you. But it is explaining how the Targaryen family, which Game of Thrones takes place after the revolution that unseats this family and kills most of it. But this show, this prequel show, takes place when this family is still in power. But it explains kind of the beginning of the decline of the Targaryens, the beginning of the decline of their dragons that give them so much of their power over this continent, which is referred to as the Seven Kingdoms. So it is about the war, the intra-family war, which ends up taking out a lot of the Targaryens as well as a lot of their dragons, and sort of begins the centuries-long decline of their power over the Seven Kingdoms. At least that's how I understand it. Someone who's read some of the books, but not all of them, and knows some of the lore, but not all of it. Okay. So the first season sets the stage for this intra-family conflict. You have this king named Viserys who only has one daughter, Rhaenyra. And of course, it's a patriarchal medieval society where it's male progeny, right? The firstborn male of the monarch. And then after that, it goes on to his closest relatives. So he has a daughter named Rhaenyra, and he basically murders his wife. I mean, his wife dies in childbirth, but she dies in childbirth because he's so eager to get a male heir that he allows the maesters, which is like their doctors, right? He allows them to perform a sedated medieval cesarean section on his wife, which brutally kills her. And then that child, which is a boy, ends up dying anyway. So partly, I think, because of the grief over this gruesome death of his wife and the acceptance at this point that he's not going to have male heirs, Viserys chooses his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir and sort of proclaims it before the kingdom. However, he also remarries to her handmaiden and best friend and ends up having a whole bunch of boy children with her. So then there are people in the kingdom, particularly his hand, who's like his closest advisor, who is the father of the handmaiden, therefore the grandfather of these new children he's had, is of course gunning for the oldest son, Aegon, to be the heir to the throne, as is tradition. And so Viserys really doesn't do anything to resolve this situation, like really to shore up Rhaenyra as heir or to try to prevent his council from scheming to replace her. He really doesn't do anything about it. Like, I guess the thing with Viserys is that he doesn't actually maybe believe that people will scheme against him. He seems to be the kind of person who believes the best in people. He believes the best of his daughter. He wants to believe the best in his brother, who he has a very contentious relationship with, which is why he doesn't want to leave him as heir. So maybe that's the explanation for why he really doesn't do anything to secure her claim. So after he dies, and he dies kind of like some form of leprosy, like he like rots to death, right? So it's a really long, gruesome death. So when he dies, of course, Aegon and all sort of the minions around him steal Rhaenyra's throne. So the first season chronicles the way in which all of the stage is set, how Rhaenyra and her best friend and handmaiden go from being like sisters, or even sometimes it was given some other than sister. Uh, but how they get from being like really, really close to becoming enemies, and the mothers of these children who are growing older and maturing and fighting over the succession. And so at the end of season one of Alicent, who is the handmaiden, the former handmaiden, who's now the queen mother, one of her sons, Aemon, kills the son of Rhaenyra, Lucas. They're both the second sons. So one second son kills the other one. So that's what's happening at the end of the first season. So basically what's been going on for the entire first half of the second season has been the kind of slow ramping up to the war that is the center of the show. And so, yeah, it has been kind of slow. It hasn't been sort of action packed. On one hand, I've been kind of like, come on, like, let's get on with it, right? On the other hand, I really appreciate this kind of slow build because it's showing that these are still family members, right? And it's no small thing for them to just start killing each other, right? Like, it's a big deal. It's still a big deal. Actually, when Aemon kills Lucas at the end of season one, it is definitely implied and even sort of stated that he didn't actually mean to kill him. He was actually just trying to intimidate him with his dragon. But when Lucas's dragon fights back to try to escape him, Aemon loses control of his dragon, who then kills Lucas and Lucas's dragon. So that wasn't even exactly intentional, right? It's no small thing for these family members and these children who grew up together, and these women, Alicent and Rhaenyra, who at one point loved each other. It's no small thing for them to just start killing each other. So for this first half of the season, every single death has had a great deal of weight to it. And there is at least some gesture. I'm not going to say there's actual mourning on both sides, but there's at least some gesture on both sides towards mourning. So the first major death is that of Lucas in the last episode of season one. And the second one, oh my gosh, this was so terrible, was the death of Aegon's firstborn, legally born, because he has a whole bunch of illegal children, but his son Jaehaerys, who is only, they don't really specify the age of the child, but I'm getting about maybe 3 years old. So this is like a toddler, right? Who is, trigger warning, sorry, I should have said that first. But Jaehaerys is a toddler who is assassinated and beheaded in his crib. It's quite terrible. They do not show that actual event on screen, but they play it. You hear the sounds of it. So it was quite awful. But you also see that event was not, Rhaenyra didn't order the death of this child. She wanted Aemon, and her hothead husband sent assassins into the castle to kill Aemon, and they killed, when they couldn't find Aemon, they killed the prince, the little boy, instead. So you have that, and then the Greens, who is Allison's side, right? This is the former handmaiden. You have the greens, the color of her family. The Hightowers is the greens. And Rhaenyra's side is referred to as the blacks. So it's the greens versus the blacks. So you have Alicent's head of her knights respond to the murder of Jaehaerys by sending an assassin to kill Rhaenyra. And this assassin is the twin brother of Rhaenyra's head of her knight, her king's guard. And one of their names is Eric and one is Auric, and I don't know which is which, right? So there's this one, I don't remember. Oh, there's this one, oh, the official podcast of the show. One of the podcasters referred to as the Parent Trap plot, which I thought was really funny. So he basically goes into the palace posing as his twin brother because him and his twin brother on opposite sides of this conflict to try to kill Rhaenyra ends up being killed in a duel by his twin brother, who then kills himself. So all of the people who are like dying first in this war are people who really just don't have nothing to do with it. Like, they didn't have anything to do with starting it. They just happened to be on these other sides, right? So we got the children first. Lucas was very young. Then we got the baby, poor sweet baby Jaehaerys. Then we got these twins who their own codes of honor put them on opposite sides of the conflict. These brothers who dearly loved each other, who kill each other basically in battle. And so next, and then we also saw in last week's episode another example of this proxy war where two families in the Riverlands, and I don't remember the names of these families. I know one of them is the Brackens, where they get into like a little tussle about boundaries that actually turns into this huge battle that kills all these people on both sides because they also have claimed for different sides of the Greens and the Blacks conflict. So, yeah, the thematics are very interesting. The thematics are really showing the way in which the conflict of these central powers is actually just hurting everybody else, right? Because probably the last people to actually die are going to be the actual people who are at the center of this, the dueling heirs, which are Rhaenyra and Aegon, right? So what this makes me think about, I have been watching the House That Dragons Built, something, the like making of the episode that HBO has after every episode of House of the Dragons. So I don't remember whether they said the Cold War was George R.R. Martin's inspiration for some of the Dance of the Dragons, or whether it's the inspiration that some of the directors are working with. But I remember hearing the Cold War referenced, and that basically this conflict is kind of like the USSR Cold War, and the dragons are the nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of parallels drawn between the dragons and nuclear weapons throughout the show. In this last episode that I'm going to get back to talking about in a second, we see our first battle with dragons involved. And some of the soldiers, even the soldiers who were fighting on the same side as the dragon that they were fighting with, were incinerated by this dragon fire. And one of the reasons that the action has moved so slowly in the show is because of the fear of taking dragons to war in a conflict where both sides have them, right? Because it's an intra-family conflict and all of the Targaryens have dragons. And the people who you most see caution against war with the dragons are the queens. It's Rhaenyra and Alicent. Like, they are the ones who keep saying, we can't, once we unloose the dragons, that's it. Like, once we unleash them, there's no calling them back, and it will be like the destruction of the kingdom, right? In the process of trying to claim it. The director of the last episode, which I'm going to talk about in a second, I'm going to have to look up his name and put it in the show notes, but the director of episode 4, the battle at Rook's Roost or whatever the place is called, y'all. I don't know. But one of the things that he said was that the big difference between this show and Game of Thrones is kind of the feminine perspective, like the way in which the show is anchored in a women's perspective. Like, yes, the Game of Thrones had some strong, complex female characters, particularly by the end of the show. Men are getting killed off in war. So by the end of the show, we have predominantly, I think, female leaders, right? Until they decide to do that mess and make Daenerys crazy and kill her off. But I'm not even going to talk about that right now. Season 8 was terrible. But one of the things he said, one of the big differences he said is the way that this show is anchored in a women's perspective in a different way. So it's not just the presence of the characters, but it's the presence of their perspective guiding a lot of moves of the show. So even though one of the complaints about this season, even by myself, I've had a couple times where I'm like, okay, let's get going. Like, when's it going to start? Right. But part of that is coming from this women's perspective because the women are thinking about the larger consequences, and the women are well aware that their sons, they each have several sons, their heirs who are the dragon riders who are going to be fighting these conflicts. They're well aware that they're going to lose children. So this just isn't a matter of sending a dragon. A dragon must have a rider in order to like do human will. So it's not just a matter of sending a dragon, it's a matter of sending a dragon along with my child. And they both know they've got multiple children and that all of these children will not survive this, particularly once the dragons get involved, because then they've got to send their children into battle, right? Which isn't typically the position that royal heirs will find themselves in. Typically, you want to hold your royals back and protect them, right? So getting back to the Cold War, the US and Russia, there is this parallel between the dragons and the atomic bomb. But we're also getting to see how that plays out with women being the leaders, or at least close to the leaders, trying to slow down the action in order to prevent these atomic bombs from being unleashed. And when we finally do start to see the atomic bombs be unleashed, it's because of the death of their children, or in Allison's case, grandchild. So one of the things about the Cold War, right, is that the Cold War was not a Cold War, right? The Cold War is like many things in history that those who have named it and described it and sort of passed down the lore around it are, are not the people who really suffered from it. The Cold War was actually a hot war in most of the colonized world and the formerly colonized world. Because what happened as the United States and the Soviet Union were facing off against each other, but not wanting to pull the trigger on using these nuclear bombs that they both had, was that they were fighting proxy wars all over the world. And the places where they were fighting were over these territories and nations that they had been colonizing, right? So the Cold War was fought in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. And actually, some of this is actually the source of some of the violence. I mean, it's actually the source for a lot of the violence that we see in Africa, the Middle East, as well as Central Europe today. Like those colonial wars are still being fought. And the people who are suffering the most, the people who are affected the most, the people who are dying the most, the people who most have the quality of their lives transformed are not the ones whose interests the wars are in the interest of. So like in House of the Dragon, you have these rulers who are fighting over their right to sit on this goddamn throne and make decisions and wear a crown and, oh, my throne, right? The people who are fighting for their interests, for their rule,
they're not the ones who are already suffering. And I think that's one of the messages of the show. So, one of the things that I like about this, as opposed to Game of Thrones, is there's more attention to that. I think there is more attention to, I mean, they call them the small folk, but like the common people, the everyday people, still not a lot, but I think we are getting like more time with kind of these characters who are everyday people than we got on the Game of Thrones show. And kind of pointing out the horribleness of it all. I think that in Game of Thrones, we were a little bit more able to fall into the fantasy and the epicness of it all and the struggle for the throne and the idea that there was someone who actually belonged there. But I think this show is sitting more in the space of this is a tragedy. It's a tragedy brought about by lineage and patriarchy and ego, because what does it matter at the end of the day who sits the throne if such trauma and destruction is raised in the process and suffered by people who didn't even ask for it, right? Or really have anything to do with it, right? There's just a lot of collateral damage. So I think it's important in the fandom as people say, oh, I'm on this side and this person has the right of claim, is to kind of remind ourselves that I think one of the messages of the show is that it's all bullshit and none of it actually matters. Right? Like, it's not about who gets to sit the throne or who had the right. It is about how this struggle for power hurts so many people, right? Particularly like the so-called common people and the innocent. So we have like these proxy deaths every episode. The first episode was the death of Prince Jaehaerys. The second episode, I believe, was the death of the twins, Eric and Arik. The third episode was the battle of those two families whose names I don't know, that ended up in this like massive deaths on both sides. And the fourth episode was the death of my good sis, Queen Rhaenys, the queen who never was. And Rhaenys, the princess, well, she was literally the princess, but they called her the queen who never was because she was passed over. She was the oldest living grandchild of King Jaehaerys at the time of his death, and she was passed over in favor of her younger cousin Viserys because Viserys was a man. And the show definitely suggests that Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, would have been a great ruler and probably would have been better than Viserys, even though in retrospect, Viserys is kind of becoming known as a good king, like a king who reigned over peace, the peaceful times in the kingdom. But during his life, there were a lot of challenges and criticisms of his rule. But now that they're entering into war and they're entering into this really dangerous time, Viserys is being called upon fondly as a king of peace. And I think that's an interesting thing too. I think the show is just saying some interesting things about history and memory, like the way in which in life someone will be actually a quite contentious figure, but upon death, all of a sudden they'll be remembered so kindly. And we could, or even not even just death, but also like once they're out of power. And we could see so many examples of this in our culture, right? Like every year at Martin Luther King Day, we get all these random people who politically just have nothing to do with anything that Dr. Martin Luther King was about. Is someone who was anti-capitalist, who was someone who was anti-militarist, someone who understood and theorized the connection between white supremacy and war and imperialism and capitalism, and came to understand that you can't just integrate into a burning house, right? You have to actually dismantle all of those systems for Black people to have freedom. someone who was standing up for labor rights and workers' rights. So he would not be with the way in which all these people, particularly like these white conservatives and liberals and moderates who tried to memorialize him as someone who was just all about getting along no matter what the color of our skin and being judged on the content of your character and on merit. People just don't have any idea what he's really about. And they just want to post all this stuff around the King holiday that has nothing to do with who he really was. And a person who had the kind of philosophy of King and presented the kind of threat to these systems of capitalism, racism, militarism, right? He was one of a very outspoken voice against the Vietnam War, which is part of like the proxy war, right? Part of the Cold War is connected to the Cold War. It's one of these hot wars that's actually connected to that conflict. But yeah, they didn't like that man, right? Like when he was alive, he was very contentious. Some of the people on the sort of more radical areas of the Black freedom movement felt like he wasn't radical enough. The people who were more liberal or moderate felt like he was too radical. The state wanted to get rid of him. They had him under all this kind of surveillance. He was super stressed out because he had all these threats on his life. Like he was not like a universally loved figure, right? But then after his death, you see this like retconning of his image. Another person kind of on the opposite spectrum who I think has got this retconning is George W. Bush, or is he HW? I don't remember. Yeah, George Bush the younger, right? Like I think that was probably the first election I voted in was George W. or H. I don't remember, but George Bush the younger, and that was a terrible presidency. That was the Iraq War, right? That was No Child Left Behind. Like it was a really, really terrible presidency to experience. But I think that with Trump, as we experience Trump, we kind of there's been this like weird retconning of George Bush's image, right? Like just because George Bush didn't mess with Trump and like respected some of the traditions of the office in a way that Trump refused to, there's this retconning of his image as if, oh, he wasn't all that bad, right? And I said, no, he was still pretty bad. And so was Clinton, actually. Clinton was actually pretty bad, terrible for Black people in many ways, right? So, it's just, I think it's just interesting how history and memory work to construct completely different stories about the same person and the same events. And that's part of what this show is about, right? The show is based on the Fire and Blood, which is the Targaryen family history that George R. Martin wrote instead of finishing the freaking book series, right? I actually didn't read Fire and Blood. Like, who has time? But I did read this, Rise of the Dragon, and this is kind of like an illustrated, abridged version of Fire and Blood. So it's the Targaryen family history, but it's just a little bit of a faster read. So I do kind of know the fate of the characters and I know what happens and I know which events of the show are in the official record. And so yeah, there's just I keep using the word interesting, and I always tell my students, interesting is not a good describer, but I find myself using the word over and over again. I think it is compelling how the show is building from something that wasn't really like a plot driven actual narrative text. It's a record, and they're building for the record to show us how the things that have come down to us in the record might have happened differently. So they're fleshing out characters and they're fleshing out conflicts and they're giving different kinds of like motivations and character dynamics that still conform to the loose outlines of the history that was handed down. But we also get to see some things that maybe weren't in the history. So the show confirms rumors, right? Like the rumor that Rhaenyra slept with her Kingsguard, Sir Christian Cole, the rumor, which isn't really confirmed, that her children were not the children of her husband, the Prince Lenore. In the last episode, there was a meeting between Rhaenyra and Alicent that was not in the histories. And in this episode, episode 4, there was actually this like twist on the battle and the involvement of the three dragons in the battle. So in the in the book version, Prince Aemon, King Aegon, King Aegon and his dragon Sunfire, Prince Aemon and his dragon Vhagar, I believe, and Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys all meet in battle at the Battle of Rook's Roost. Hopefully, I'm saying that right because these names be tearing me up. And it's planned that way, like it's planned for the prince and the king to go into battle. But in the show, the plan was only for Prince Aemon to go into battle with Vhagar because it's like you can't be sending the king into battle. Like the king needs to be protected. However, the show also has this conflict that's happening between these brothers where they kind of hate each other. Well, I don't even think Aegon hates Aemon. He's just a bully and he's just always bullying him. And Aemon like hates Aegon, right? And so the suggestion is actually that Aegon was left behind, but because he's so frustrated and upset about the way in which he feels like he's being ignored by his council and left out of things and not being taken seriously as a ruler, he takes it upon himself to fly into this battle. And then Aemon, instead of protecting his brother, he sort of hangs back and lets him get, and his dragon get torn up a bit by Rhaenys. And then he actually like lights them both on fire. So it definitely suggests that he tries to kill his brother, right? But that does not make it into the official history. The official history is just kind of these two princes gloriously riding into battle beside each other, and then Aegon ended up really hurt. So that's like one of the many sort of tweaks and different things that happen that are different. And I feel like some of the purists, some of the show purists, miss that, right? Like, this isn't the way it happened in the books. That never happened in the books. This never happened. And it's like, yeah, the books are the official record. The show is fleshing out the specific record, is showing us the things that maybe the record couldn't capture because they wouldn't have access to all the characters' inner motivations. And also, sometimes things just have to be simplified, right, for the purpose of TV. So the way that the death of Jaehaerys happened was different because of the difference in the dynamics when you make Jaehaerys the only prince, the only male heir. So in the books, there is another child, there's another boy, and the Queen Helena is forced to choose between her boy children by the assassins. And then she chooses the younger one, to protect the heir. And then the assassins kill the heir and tell the younger one that his mother wanted him dead. So it just destroys her relationship with her child, destroys her sanity. So I think that the show changed that up a bit by having her choose between the male and the female child. And that works dramatically because it creates another parallel of these thematics around patriarchy and the female child being passed over. The reason that Aegon is able to assert his right to the throne is because he is the male. So the Greens are asserting their right to power based on male progeny. So then it makes it more dramatically ironic that then his male son, his only male son, because in the show there's just this one, is killed because now he doesn't have a male heir, right? At least not in his direct line. That also puts Aemond directly in line for the throne, which introduces these interesting dynamics in the conflict between those brothers and whether Aemon actually desires his brother's throne. So I'm really interested in adaptation. That's something I've talked about before on the podcast is, the adaptations of The Little Mermaid. I had an episode where I talked about the adaptation of Tananarive Dew's short story, The Lake, into film form and the ways in which writers make different choices in order to heighten the dramatic tension on screen. For the most part, I think the choices they're making are really good. Now, a choice I think is not A choice that I think I would have done differently if I were adapting this is the choice to kind of align the audience more with Rhaenyra and the Blacks. I think that one of the reasons the show does this is because the show is kind of anchored in a women's perspective in this way and engaging in a kind of critique of patriarchy, right? The only reason why Rhaenyra loses her throne or gets usurped is because she's female. So many things happen just because like the birth of girl children, versus boys. So I think that that creates a kind of automatic alignment if the show is being critical of patriarchy and that the only reason Aegon even has a claim that some see as stronger than Rhaenyra's is because of patriarchy, then the show has to be on Rhaenyra's side to a certain extent. But I also think there have been a lot of other narrative choices that have put us on Rhaenyra's side. Like, who the hell out there is agreeing? Who? This whole thing with the marketing of the show. Are you rooting for the Greens or the Blacks? And I'm like, who would root for the Greens? I just feel like the first season, especially, just kind of went out of its way to portray pretty much everybody on the green side as just a complete deviant and ingrate, right? We saw Aegon, trigger warning for sexual assault. We saw Aegon raping maids. We saw him prize fighting his own bastard children. We saw him masturbating out of a window. We saw some foot fetish stuff going on with Allison and Laris. And I'm not fetish shame. I'm not kink shaming. I'm not kink shaming. If you're into feet, nothing wrong with that. But the way in which the show, because it was just random, like these aren't characters who are intimately involved with each other. So clearly her showing this man her feet was part of some weird power dynamic with them. So it makes it like deviant, right? As any other sexual act within that context would appear as deviant because these aren't characters that have that kind of intimacy with each other. Like, I feel like she was showing her feet to someone who was actually her lover. I don't feel like it would have been a thing. But it just seemed like the show's gone out of its way to just make everybody on that side just so terrible that and meanwhile we're seeing Rhaenyra have a lot of concern for the realm and a lot of affection for her children. Allison is a terrible mother. Like we've always seen her be a terrible mother. So having a lot of affection for her children, a lot of tenderness, a lot of concern for what will happen to her people. Yeah, so yeah, and I don't think it was I think that there is a way dramatically to create empathy for both sides. I think this season is actually doing that a little bit better. I'm actually starting to feel a little bit sorry for Aegon, but I can't feel too sorry for him because I saw the mess he did in the first season. I saw him sexually assaulting women. I saw him not caring. Like, yeah, I see him mourning the death of his little boy now, his prince, Jaehaerys. But in the first season, we saw him not caring at all about all these other little kids he's created. In fact, he's going to like watch them fight each other in the pits, like to death, I'm assuming. Right. So yeah, I just can't feel that sorry for him. The actor, though, Tom Glenn Carney, he is the actor playing Aegon. He is playing the heck out of this part. He's playing the part so well that it does start to make you want to have some empathy for the character. It's not a likable character, but there are dimensions of his character you understand because he kind of never had a chance. He was just parented so terribly that's why he's terrible, but he actually wants to be taken seriously. He wants to, but he's just terrible, right? So I don't know. That's a layered character, and I feel like if they had made him just a little less terrible in the first season, there would be more emotion now in watching the portrayal now, which has a lot more layers to it. So I would have liked to see the show build up more empathy and affection and understanding on both sides. Because now, as they're coming into direct conflict with each other, and as the deaths are really going to start piling up, the dramatic and the emotional resonance would be even better because you're kind of rooting for both sides and not wanting to see anyone get hurt. And I think a movie that did that well was Troy, that Troy movie with Brad Pitt. I think that movie did a really good job of setting up kind of parallel investment. So when it came to a really big fight scene like Achilles and Hector, even though I guess I probably a little bit more was on the side of Hector because he's like trying to protect his family. But yeah, you felt for both sides of that. So that made that battle so exciting because you didn't want either one of them to die, right? You didn't want it to be one-sided. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like they've already done it. Like they already set the groundwork for the blacks being favored. And then even when I've listened to the podcast for the show and some of the directors, most of the directors are kind of blatantly on the sides of the blacks, right? So I don't think that perspective is going to shift enough to hide in the amount of dramatic tension. Okay, I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop here. So the last episode, we had the death of Rhaenys. We had our first big dragon battle. The dragon battle looked incredible, amazing. Because I knew Rhaenys was gonna die, it was hard for me to watch. I kind of was like this and like almost tempted to fast forward. It's weird. Like I like horror, I like excitement, but I don't like it that much. Like sometimes even when I'm watching a horror film or an action film, I'll like fast forward so that I could see the results and the outcomes because I can't handle the tension. And then I'll go back and watch it. So I'm excited to watch it again now that I've already seen how it ends up. But yeah, it was really exciting and it really captured also the tragedy and the horror of this level of warfare to all the people who are beneath on the ground. And it's only going to sort of ramp up and get worse. Shouts out to Bayla. Bayla, my black girl riding a dragon. First time I've ever seen that on screen. And it really warms my black fantasy loving heart. When I saw Bayla, I think it was episode 2 or episode 3, dive down on her dragon, I almost cried because I've never seen a black girl on a dragon on screen. I've never seen a black girl on a dragon in any book that I've ever read. I've just never seen it. We don't really get to be in these kinds of fantasy worlds that often in more pivotal roles. And Bayla is not a huge pivotal role. I can't actually even remember actually what happens in Rise of the Dragon. I do think she survives, which is nice. But yeah, they've got her talking to the council. They've amped up a role a little bit that I don't really remember being huge in the book. I'm going to have to kind of review to see what was going on with Bayla. In the books, they're not black, so I wasn't really paying attention. But yeah, that was just so exciting. And I'm excited to see more of the Black Valarians. We've got some of Corlys's bastard sons who are coming into the show as Dragon Seed, who are additional riders for some of the unclaimed dragons that the Blacks have on their side. So I am excited for that. We're going to see some Black men riding some dragons too. So yeah, I love the Valarians. I do think that the Valarians' alliance with Rhaenyra, if you think about it too hard, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if you watch the first season, you basically see that Rhaenyra and Daemon are responsible for the deaths of Corlys and Rhaenys's Valarian's children, at least the believed death of their children, because Lenore is actually still alive, but nobody knows that. So the fact that Rhaenys was so loyal to Rhaenyra, sometimes I question, but the actress Eve Best just did such a great job with the role and just the gravitas and the wisdom, the blend of hard and soft, right? Rhaenys was a very fierce character, but you also saw her and the tenderness with her husband, and she was just a wonderful character who's going to be really missed. But yeah, her being so loyal to Rhaenyra is a little bit confusing when you know that she did suspect Rhaenyra for the death of her son, and that she never that it was never kind of resolved. Like, but when I talked about this show last year, I'm rooting for everybody black, right? So the Valarians are over there with the blacks. So with the Blacks, it is what it is. I hope to see more Black people riding dragons. Oh, one thing that I forgot that I wanted to address. This was something I really wanted to talk about. So I listen to the House of Dragons podcast, every episode, the official podcast for the show. So every episode, they have one of the actors on, and they have one of the, like a director, set designer, they have somebody like that on as well. And so the episode, I don't remember if it was 2 or 3, that had Bela's big scene with her dragon swooping down. They had Bethany on Antonia on, who is the actress who plays Bela. And they asked her all the usual questions. And then at the end, one of the hosts is like, "So tell us about your wig." And there was a little bit of a pause because I could tell that Bethany Antonia, or Antonia, however you say it, was a little bit taken aback. But then she was like, "Oh, yeah, yeah." And apparently she like shaved her head so that her wig would fit better. But she talked about it. But I just thought I felt some kind of way about that because they've had several actors from the show. They've had Tom Clarney on. They've had the guy who played Damon on. They had Eve Best on. And everybody is wearing wigs. All the white people are wearing wigs too. Everyone is wearing wigs. And Bethany was the only one that they asked about the wig. It just it just annoyed me. It annoyed me. It annoyed me so much. It reminded me of, and again, it reminded me of like the Little Mermaid controversy when like she was first cast and people were saying, "Oh, she can't be Ariel because she can't have red hair." And it's like, not only are there Black people with naturally red hair, but we could dye our hair just like you can. Some of these white actresses who you're suggesting play the part, that's hair dye too, right? It's just like white people do the same kind of modification, weaves and extensions and hair dye. Like, just because they're white doesn't mean that they have naturally silver hair. Everyone's wearing a wig. So why is the Black actress the only one who got asked about her wig? That annoyed the hell out of me. It annoyed me so much. But yeah, that was just one thing. So like, we're in these fantasy worlds, but there's still always these little moments, these little things. I feel like people do these little microaggressions, just like the kind of microaggressions you experience when you're like the only Black person at work, or you're a Black professor, right? I've certainly been through it. But like, people just do these little things that kind of remind you, or to suggest that, oh, you're not supposed to be there. And I felt like, I'm sure it wasn't intended this way, but I felt like that's kind of what that moment was, because why does she get asked about the wig and nobody else gets asked about the wig, and they are all wearing wig, right? The only person whose wig I want to know about is Amon's, because I mean, that hair is laid. Amon, the most cool looking character. He is such a cool looking character. But yeah, so I did want to address that because, yeah, I felt some kind of way about that. So that brings me to the end. So I'm going to be doing some more episodes like this where I talk about other things that are happening in fantasy, other things I'm interested in. Of course, we'll always come back to Black mermaids, but I want this to be a space to talk about other stuff that's going on in the fantasy world that I'm sure some of us are also fans of. So I hope that you enjoyed this. Thank you for indulging it. And thank you for listening to the Merwomanist podcast.
You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at mommy, that's MAMI, _Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalandra Davis, or my website, jalandradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.